Here's a book that every Steelers fan should add to their library. It's called A Different Way to Win, Dan Rooney's story from the Super Bowl to the Rooney Rule. I sat down with author Jim Rooney to talk about his personal and professional view of his father's long career both in football and his service to the nation. Here's part of that conversation. As we've said, most people, when they hear your dad's name or your last name, they think football, they think Steelers, but something very important to your father was Ireland, and he had the chance, thanks to former President Barack Obama, to be the ambassador to Ireland. Why was that so important for him to move so far away outside of Pittsburgh to do something for another country?
So absolutely, and it was one of the greatest honors of his life when President Obama nominated my father to become ambassador to Ireland. But many years before that, back in the late 60s, early 70s, he began to travel to Ireland. And during that time, you had what they call the Troubles. In Northern Ireland, you have 6 counties that remain part of Great Britain. 1921 is when this was divided, and you have the Republic of Ireland, which is the 26 counties, mainly in the south. And those are two separate countries, and there was barbed wire everywhere, and there were tanks that would be driving down the street, and I will never forget these dark gray buildings with these gray clouds over them with barbed wire between every home. You felt that sense of being in a police state. And my father, in his usual way, would walk up to any door, to any person, and just start talking to people about what was going on. And then he built this charity along with a gentleman named Tony O'Reilly, who was the CEO of the H.J. Heinz Corporation and who was a native of Dublin, that raised a tremendous amount of money for education, integrating the education. So the numbers, most of the schools then were separate. You either went to a Catholic school or you went to a Protestant school, and these were public schools. And they said, look, we need to make sure that everyone has the same level of capability, getting back to that education love that my father had. If folks are gonna overcome these problems, you have to find ways that their skills and their capabilities are commensurate. In terms of workforce development, he funded several incubators that after you got to a certain point, you could start off with sort of 2 or 3 Catholic or 2 or 3 Protestant employees, but once you got to a certain size or a certain level of capital raised, you had to be fully integrated. You had to be 50% Catholic, 50% Protestant, and there are several companies that still exist that came out of some of that work, and this commitment to trying to find and create alternatives to the challenges, to the troubles as they called them, was a life's work for him there as well. And it took a long time, and there were a lot of fits and starts, and he was engaged both directly and indirectly with the politicians from the United States, from Ireland, from Northern Ireland, from Britain, in terms of putting together these peace deals. And you would get close. In 1982, you had what's called the Anglo-Irish Agreement, and it had the framework of an independent Northern Ireland government that would also report to Great Britain, but would have power sharing with the Republic of Ireland. My father was involved. Now, he wasn't directly involved in terms of negotiating, but he was regularly bringing these folks together in different forums to have communications, to talk about the peace process. John Hume, who is considered the Martin Luther King of Ireland, became a very close friend of my father's, and John Hume won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1998 because he had done this work of realizing that this wasn't two-sided, that it was a very complex issue that you had to address. As I said, the education, the workforce development, the housing situations, and really building a political approach from that standpoint. And so my father would convene conversations here in the United States. He would introduce these folks to congressmen on both sides of the aisle so that they could plead their case, because the United States, again, was going to be such an essential partner if this peace process was ever going to come about, and then if it was ever going to hold. So this work really became where my father spent so much time and effort while he was still, running a team that would win 4 Super Bowl championships, negotiating labor deals that would become the hallmark of our industry for, 30 years beyond their date, running a family of 9 children, and this commitment really was essential to, I think, the heart of what my father was all about. He saw the suffering, he saw the violence, he saw the acrimony that was there, the hatred that these folks had between each other, and he never thought there was a legitimate reason for it to be there. I mean, certainly people did things to each other that he didn't like and he thought were horrible, but essentially it offended him that they couldn't find ways to not continue to engage in violence. And so he really tried to build structures and processes and get other people to donate money and make the commitments that became so essential to what became this peace process. President Clinton, first President Reagan, recognized my father at a White House ceremony in 1986 for this work. President Clinton put together the people that created the infrastructure that would evolve to the Good Friday Agreement and the peace process, talked about when he was in the United States soon after that agreement, in the sentence is, if we didn't have people like Dan Rooney, we would have never had the groundwork to create the peace process that resulted in that. And then it was never, there's still challenges to the peace process. President Obama nominates my father to become ambassador. He becomes ambassador. We all expected that to be a retirement job, or at least intended it to be a retirement job. And of course, my father did not do that. And he went over there, and you still had, some remnants, some issues of the troubles that needed to be worked on. You had the continued integration of the police force in Northern Ireland, and he focused on that. You had a growing Muslim population in Ireland, and he created forums, these interfaith conversations at the United States Embassy, and so many of the as I said, this growing Muslim population in Dublin spoke to. It was the first time that anyone had really seen them as a community that should have a voice, and he built out this program over the 4 years he was there that became sort of an essential hallmark of what he did. He visited all 32 counties, which was very important to him. No ambassador had ever gone to every part of Ireland. And when you talk to Jake Sullivan, who was an Assistant Secretary of State, he said, we were really preaching this idea of diplomacy beyond sort of the boardrooms and to get out there and get this public diplomacy going. And your father was the oldest ambassador, yet he was the person we had to teach least how to take on this role of public diplomacy. And he said, I've never seen someone so intuitive, including a lot of politicians, with how to do this. And he went to every county and he built this relationship of trust. He would bring the economic advisors so they would talk about helping with economic development. One of the big things he did in the west of Ireland, there's an airport called Shannon Airport, and he worked to get an agreement between Delta Airlines and Shannon, so there's a flight from Atlanta to Shannon Airport, and that's really a boost to their economy out there. He also worked to bring Irish companies to the United States, so it was a two-way street in terms of the direct financial investment that he was working to have. And then the big thing he did was the football game. So every year on the 4th of July, in every embassy across the world, on July 4th, you have a baseball game, except in Ireland when Dan Rooney was ambassador. So he brought in a mini Super Bowl, and he got sponsors. There's no taxpayer dollars. I want everyone to hear that. There's no taxpayer dollars, but he got sponsors to sponsor this event. And he brought in stands, he brought in jumbotrons. He built this they would build this amazing field, Croke Park, which is the big stadium in Dublin, built this fantastic field for them. And at the center of the field, you had the seal of the United States of America. Like we have the Steelers symbol at Heinz Field, you had the seal of the United States of America. And you had the Marines would play, and then a bunch of Irish recruits, and then some of my family members. My son, who was a high school football player at the time, Danny Rooney, Art's son, who was playing high school and college football at the time. They all contributed. Art, my brother, and my brother Dan were the coaches, and they almost got in a fight on the sidelines during one dispute, and I was the announcer of the first game. So I guess everyone had the right role in those, but it was really important to my father that he do something that had this type of meaning. Katie Keogh, who was in charge of engagement at the embassy, always talks about that it was the best, she calls it friend-raising event, and that this was essential to building the database, to having these relationships with other diplomats, with people throughout Ireland. And she said there has never been, and she says there will never be, anything as effective as the football game that my father put on in Ireland. So it was a lot of fun, but like you can imagine, he was all in, and there was a lot of work around this game.
Now, with all that being said about Ireland, how did your dad take maybe quote unquote the playbook for success he used in the football world and then apply that to being the ambassador?
So I think by this point he was beyond playbooks. He was like one of those quarterbacks in their 40s where everything was in his head, and he went over there and he was all in. He committed to, as we talked about, populations that were not being seen or not invited to sort of the table to have a voice. He met with every official in Ireland that I can think of. I still have people tell me they had this great conversation with him. He really tried to push this sense of hope around the United States to the community and have them feel that they had a special partner in the United States and live the values that I think are so essential in another country. And I think that's the number one role of an ambassador. So he took that on fully, and it was every day. I mean, he had something going on in the morning. He would have a lunch or an afternoon activity. He would go home and take a little bit of a nap. He was into his 80s by this point, and then he would have some type of evening event with these folks. My mother certainly talked about it wearing everyone out but him. One of the fun stories, though, happened even beyond this time frame, was a call at 3 in the morning. And so the last time U2 played in Pittsburgh, I got to run into Bono, on the field, the lead singer of U2. And he was just so kind in talking about my dad and offering his condolences. This was obviously after my father passed. He said, I got to tell you this story. He said, I don't tell too many people this because it's a little bit embarrassing. He says, but I was upset about something, and Bono's saying, I don't even know what I was upset about, but I decided I was going to call the ambassador and tell him what needed to be done. So somehow I call the ambassador's residence in Dublin, and he picks up the phone at 3 a.m. And he says, again, I don't remember what we were arguing about, but I gave him a hard time for about 15 minutes, and in his disarming way, he assured me that everything was going to be all right. And then we stayed on the phone until dawn that morning. That he got to talk to my father until dawn. So that was kind of a cool event where Bono and my father would, I imagine them talking on the phone all night about a whole bunch of things throughout the world. So his approach was all in. The other thing that was important to him was the United States. And so every year on St. Patrick's Day, what we call the Taoiseach, which is the Prime Minister of Ireland, gets to visit the White House and gets a one-on-one conversation. It's a good thing about having one day that is reflective of your heritage, that that's the day that the Prime Minister of Ireland will be in the White House. And so my father his role was to set that meeting up, to make sure that everything was prepared, to make sure that the conversations, folks were prepared going in, and he got to sit in the Oval Office with the President, the Secretary of State, the Prime Minister of Ireland, the Taoiseach, and my father. And those moments just meant a whole lot to him, getting to be involved in those conversations. There were some things going on with national security at the time. There were some things related to the economic process and how economies globally were struggling then, and what the approach to Ireland was. And then, as I think folks might know, the United States troops that would be going to Afghanistan and Iraq, their last stop for refueling would occur in Ireland, in the west of Ireland, in Shannon. And so my father would go out regularly. My father and mother would actually go out regularly and meet these folks. And he talked about when they were going to war, how somber it was, and some of his aides would talk about just this magnificent, wise sort of grandfather that he brought there to that experience. And then when they were coming home, it was a big party. And he had a lot of fun, and they would talk about him really giving a hard time to the Ravens fans and the Patriots fans and the Browns fans. And the guys with terrible towels would love him. But this great banter would go on between him and those folks. So when he would go back to the White House, he would talk about the troops and what their experience was, although it was brief, being in Ireland and making sure that everything they needed was there in Ireland, that any way Ireland could support, that he would be able to get them on board, and that it was essential strategic partnership as well.
Now, in terms of the long game, it's something you mentioned already in this interview, but in the book, what exactly is the long game, and how did that apply to your father?
So this idea of the long game, I think when we think about modern business, on a certain degree, we have to be faster. Tools, technology, etc., have increased the pace of the world. But I don't think that's something that has to be done in every situation. So if you look in 1960, television revenue for the league was about $4.6 million. It's a lot more than that today. And my father was an essential component to that. And it was that commitment to saying, okay, we don't have to make every dollar today. Let's build something. Let's build infrastructure that will allow us to be more successful, that will allow fans to really enjoy and engage their passion in us. When you look at Ireland, again, to get the peace process that we got, we're now at a point where 2 generations of kids have lived in relative peace in Ireland. And before that, that wasn't the case. And that contribution took, 40 years to really make happen. The Rooney Rule, we certainly have a long way to go. Absolutely, I think anyone that looks at the issue of fairness and opportunity, equity, we're not where we need to be, but there has been substantial progress in terms of the numbers of coaches interviewed, the numbers of head coaches hired, the numbers of head coaches and general managers who are minorities who have taken their teams to Super Bowls. All of those changes have come because these commitments have been, there and substantial, but committed to over a very long period of time, and they weren't quick fixes. They weren't, off-the-cuff ideas. They were well thought out. They took time. There was failures in all of them, and sometimes still is. But there is that consistency, that commitment, that championing, that advocacy that my father brought to make sure that these things were done well. And I think those are things that, in business and I think to some degree in life, we can integrate more of that approach.